Well, let me welcome all of you to this ICS conversation on the India-China relations at an inflection point, which is being hosted by the Institute of Chinese Studies. We have the print as a media partner. We are live streaming this event on our YouTube channel. I would like to extend a especially warm welcome to our distinguished panelists, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, former Ambassador of India to China, respected China expert, and currently distinguished professor with Symbiosis International University in Pune. Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan, Professor of International Politics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, a well-known scholar who has written extensively on India-China relations, and Tom Miller, senior analyst with Hong Kong-based Gautam Research. Tom has spent 14 years in China and authored two highly acclaimed books on urbanization in China and China's Asian dream. He closely follows China, India, and India-China relations. This formidable panel will discuss the present crisis in India-China relations and the likely future trajectory of this critical relationship. Our panelists will explore whether India-China relations are at a turning point or watershed moment after the border clash of 15 June, resulting in the death of 20 Indian army personnel, and casualties on the Chinese side as well. Gautam, Rajesh, and Tom will also help us understand whether some normalcy can be restored to bilateral relations if there is an early resolution of multiple standoff situations along the line of actual control in India-China border areas, or whether we have entered a new, qualitatively different and more troubled phase in the relationship. They will examine India-China relations in the larger geopolitical context of escalating US-China strategic rivalry, China's aggressive behavior on range of issues, and the increased international backlash to Chinese actions in the COVID era. We are looking forward to getting the insights of our distinguished panelists on these important issues. Before I commence this dialogue, let me explain briefly some ground rules. For the first 35 minutes or so, I'll have a conversation with our three panelists when we'll mute all other participants. Thereafter, we'll have the question and answer session involving other participants. You may indicate your interest in asking questions to the panelists by using the raise hand option available at the bottom of the list of participants. Questions can also be sent to me through the chat option. Please do identify the panelist you're addressing your question to. I will call on participants to ask their questions during the Q&A session. The concerned participants will unmute himself or herself. Other participants are requested to keep them muted to avoid any ambient or background noise. Let me now begin with Ambassador Gautam Bambawale. Gautam is an old colleague of mine. Gautam, like me, devoted nearly 15 years of his diplomatic career dealing with China in different capacities, including as Joint Secretary East Asia at the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi, as ambassador in Beijing. Gautam, let me begin with a question about recent developments, what has happened over the last couple of days in India-China relations. As you know, following talks between the special representatives of India and China on the boundary question last Sunday, we have some encouraging news about disengagement of troops of the two countries in Galwan River Valley and Hot Spring in the western sector. Do you think the situation is on the mend? Are we moving towards the resolution of the present standoff situations, or will it take much longer to see that there is a real improvement in the situation along the border areas? What's your take, Gautam?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Ashok. And let me say it's a great pleasure to be with all our colleagues in the Institute of Chinese Studies and others on this webinar. To quickly come to your question, I believe that what has happened this summer on the India-China border is something which is qualitatively different. I believe it's going to take time to resolve even from here on. And I believe that as you have posed in your material, that India-China relations are indeed at an inflection point. Let me just expand a wee bit on that, Ashok, and take just 2 or 2.5 minutes to explain my viewpoint. One is, if we start with the question of what are the Chinese saying or messaging or signaling to India with what they have done on the border. And I think the answer to that question is twofold. On the ground itself, and on the tactical side, they're showing that they want to have their actual control right up till what they consider their line of actual control or their boundary with India, which means that they want to do it unilaterally, not bilaterally as it should be between two sovereign countries. So this is one. And on the strategic side, I think they're signaling to India that, look, you must understand that our comprehensive national power is many times yours. You must understand the pecking order in Asia, if not the world, and you please take your place in that pecking order. And you must understand all this. Uh, India has reacted on the ground by, especially militarily, by saying we will not take this lying down. We do not accept Chinese hegemony and bullying, and we will stand up to you. Now, if we have to continue sending this message, and we need to, because if we let things go back to normal and have business as usual, we will be sending absolutely the opposite signal to what we have sent militarily on the ground. And therefore, I have argued, and I am arguing here again, that India will have to take many more policy measures which will impact the India-China relationship negatively to show our displeasure with China. And let me stop there at this point and hand it back to you, Ashok.
Gautam, thanks for your answer. So you are arguing that the India-China relations are indeed at an inflection point, and we are entering qualitatively different phase in our relationship. Now, for last 3 decades now, India has broadly pursued a policy of constructive engagement with China. We have compartmentalized differences and irritants while we have pursued, expansion of relations in different areas. You have been closely involved with this policy in different capacities, as I mentioned earlier. Do you think this policy is running out of steam now and a course correction or even reset is required? If that's the case, what are the options available to India? You alluded to those options. Can you elaborate on options we have with us today?
Sure. In answer to all your questions, Ashok, let me say that policy of engagement has already run out of steam. It ran out of steam in early May 2020. And as a result, India needs to undertake a fundamental reassessment of its China policy, and we need to recalibrate our China policy. I have, of course, asked for a wider discussion on this question, but I think we will need to do something very soon. The banning of 59 Chinese apps was a first step, but I have been arguing for a second economic step, which would be of banning Chinese companies from participating in 5G trials and rollout in India, just like the UK did a few days ago. So this is one of the suggestions I am making, but we will have to take a look at the entire gamut of relations and see where we can reduce our relationship. Let me also say very clearly, because many people say that this will be painful to India. Of course, it will be painful to India. There's no doubt about that. But if you don't send a very firm message and send a wishy-washy message that it can be business as usual, you'll be negating everything that we have signaled on the ground militarily in Eastern Ladakh and in other parts of the LAC.
Gautam, I think I missed the last part of your comment. Can you just repeat the last line?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'm sorry about that. Maybe connectivity is a little, on the blink right now. But what I was saying was that many people felt that when we recalibrate our China policy, it might hurt India too, and it would be painful for India too. And there is no doubt about that. It will be painful for India, but we will just have to take that amount of pain. That's the basic point I was trying to make, Ashok.
Are you suggesting that we are moving towards some degree of economic decoupling with China? If not decoupling, at least a very deliberate and calibrated policy of reducing economic dependence on China and also pushing back on China's influence in India. You referred to, prohibition of 59 apps. It suggested some additional steps like, taking Huawei out of field trial for 5G telephony in India. How do you see this policy panning out? Are we at the beginning of a new long-term trend in India-China economic engagement?
I think, yes, I agree with the words you have used of some kind of decoupling. It's not a complete decoupling, but we will choose where we want to decouple. There could, of course, be pushback from the Chinese side, and we should expect that completely. There would be some retaliation, there would be some reactions. So I think India-China relations are going to get worse and are going to deteriorate before they can get better.
If I could, request you to elaborate further on what kind of, reset or course correction we can undertake in our relations with China. There is a bilateral dimension to it, and there is also, a policy of dealing with China in the larger geopolitical setting. Do you think, yesterday, day before yesterday, we had a lecture by Dr. Elizabeth Economy, who argued that USA has moved towards the policy of counter and contain China. Do you think in case of India also, from engagement, we move to policy of countering China? Do you think that's on the anvil?
Well, I definitely see, and because you're trying to highlight the international angle to this whole situation, I definitely see a strengthening of India's relationships and partnerships with the democracies of the world, not just the United States, which definitely is one of the partners with which we will strengthen our relations, but also with Japan, with Australia, with South Korea, and possibly even with Indonesia and others like Western Europe. So I definitely see that happening. And I can see a little bit of decoupling between India and China, not just in the economic field, but in other areas also.
And elsewhere, you've argued that we need to revisit a policy on issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan or South China Sea. What's your take on that?
Absolutely. I continue to hold that, there are sensitive spots in China itself, like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Tibet, and India must try to leverage to the extent possible these sensitive and blind spots where China is concerned. What exactly we do is something which will require a larger discussion like that today, or even larger in all of India. But I definitely am a votary for using these leverages against China.
In short, Gautam, what you are suggesting involves a fairly fundamental recalibration or even reset in India's China policy, isn't it?
Absolutely, Ashok. I think the death of scores of Indian and Chinese soldiers after a gap of 45 years, where and in those 45 years, that we have put in a whole architecture for maintaining peace on the borders. And this architecture, unfortunately, has broken down. And the old consensus, or the template, the paradigm in which India-China relations were existing so far since December of 1988, was that if peace is maintained on the border, then the rest of the relationship will move forward. If peace is not maintained on the border, the rest of the relationship will be impacted negatively and adversely.
Thank you, Gautam. We'll get back to you. But let me now turn to Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan. Rajesh, there has been much debate in India on what's driving or motivating the recent Chinese behavior along the India-China LAC. Why China has crossed the LAC and activated the borders along multiple locations in a rather aggressive manner. As Gautam pointed out, this is not something, in keeping with past trends. We are in a different situation today. As a scholar who has closely followed military matters, what's your assessment? Why China is behaving the way it is?
Well, Ambassador Kanta, thank you for inviting me. And thank you for asking me the easiest question on the panel. Because understanding why China is doing what it is doing is somewhat somewhat difficult, but I
I
would go
thought
with
I'll reserve that question for a scholar. No.
but the point is that, as Ambassador Bambawale mentioned, the second point that he mentioned about China's general attitude, I think is important. China sees itself as the dominant player, and it sort of sees it has a pecking order. But I think if we could take a step back also. I think China's policy towards India has generally been containment, and going back decades, it has generally seen India as primarily a South Asian power, and it has generally sought to keep India within South Asia. That is why historically, some of the things that China has done vis-a-vis India and Pakistan cannot be explained by anything other than the fact that China has wanted India to be contained within South Asia. Now, at this particular moment, in the last couple of years, after Doklam, after the Quad, the beginnings of the Quad, and of course, in the context of the pandemic, I think China's paranoia has made it sort of lash out even more, and therefore, it is even more intent on ensuring that India sort of stays within South Asia. I think that sort of it is at one level, one could argue that it is an extreme form of realism, hyper realism. But I think China also calculates that given the huge power differential between it and most of the powers in Indo-Pacific, including India, that it can get away with it, and that it can ensure that these countries do not respond in a manner that China cannot manage. But I think it's also that to a large extent, China seems to think that deterrence requires that it not back down, that deterrence requires that others are constantly afraid of China. And if you look at much of the South China Seas, the way China has behaved, the South China Seas, also it has used small excuses of Vietnam building on a rock, putting up a hut on a rock or something like that, and then expanded that as a rationale for building massive fairly large bases and militarizing those bases and so on and so forth. So it is, I think it is, on the one hand, it is that their traditional policy towards India, which is of containment of India. And the other part is in terms of their attitude of partly the deterrence element, but also a reflection of the fact that they feel that given the power differential, that they can actually ensure that there is no backlash, or whatever backlash there is, that they will be able to contain that backlash. I think so. It's a mix of these motivations. But I do think that maybe what happened in Doklam, I'm not a China expert, unlike most of you here, but I think what happened in Doklam did have an impact in terms of their domestic politics, and I think that has had that experience has also been partly responsible for the way China has behaved.
Thanks, Rajesh. You mentioned that China has been trying to contain India. You have been arguing for quite some time now that India should lead a containment strategy vis-a-vis China. You have also suggested that China's rise poses a strategic challenge to India, and the best way for India to respond is to pursue a closer strategic alignment with USA. Do you see these ideas of yours, which you have been articulating for quite some time now, will be gaining greater traction under current changed circumstances? As you know, there are still reservations about moving away from the policy of strategic autonomy and doubts about the reliability of the USA as a strategic partner. How do you look at the future trends in this area in terms of our making common cause with other countries with shared concerns vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, I think, I have argued that India should balance against China for the simple reason that China is the most powerful actor that is India's neighbor. It is proximate to India. We have a border, obviously, which is always in trouble. And it's the huge power differential that has taken place over the last 2 or 3 decades means that it's a country that we need to worry about. So common sense would suggest that you have to balance against a power of that magnitude on your borders. Um, I do not, I mean, and we do not have the internal capacity to be able to balance China on our own. Our traditional approach has been to sort of use our own resources to balance against China, and that is, that works to some extent, but that is difficult. That strategy is difficult to employ when the power differential grows as much as it has between India and China, and so that strategy is no longer viable. An internal balancing strategy is no longer viable, which basically means that the only options that we have are either, appeasing or making our peace with China, accepting China's dominance and hegemony within Asia, or else balancing China with the help of others. Now, while suggesting that we need to do the latter, that is balancing China, I'm also aware of the difficulties of doing that. I don't think this is easy. I think it is extremely difficult to, considering the fact that most of the other Indo-Pacific powers, I'm leaving US out for the minute, but all of the other powers, whether it is Japan or Australia or the smaller Southeast Asian countries or Indonesia, India, all of these countries are far weaker than China. And even combined, we would all not have sufficient capacity to balance against China. So that means that basically any country within this region that takes the initiative will automatically find itself on the crosshairs of China. And so that is even though India has to move in that direction, nevertheless, that is very difficult to do without the United States being the anchor to that sort of a balancing effort. And that's why I have suggested that India needs the United States, India as well as other Indo-Pacific powers, but many of them are already aligned with the United States. India is not. And so without the United States being part of that alignment, it is impossible to create that balance. I mean, we are not, none of us, the burden sharing problems, the variety of problems that we will have in terms of coming together, in terms of combining our strength, are so great that without the United States being the guarantor of some of this kind of a partnership, maybe part of the traditional, a form of the traditional American hub and spoke system, or maybe something larger, something that comes out of the Quad. But without the United States, I don't think this effort will succeed. And so the United States in that respect becomes vital to creating that balance, I think. And that's why I emphasize the United States. But like I said, even with the United States, and of course, the United States itself has its own problems today. But even with the United States, this is not going to be easy. This is not going to be an easy task. There's a natural temptation in any of these efforts to pass the burden on to the most powerful state, or the state that is most willing to do it, in this case the United States. And so if that sort of free riding tendency takes place, then again this it becomes difficult to create that sort of a balance, because I'm not sure the United States any longer is willing to permit others to free ride, and so that does make it difficult to, even with the United States, to create that kind of a balance.
Rajesh, can you elaborate a little bit on what you are proposing will mean in practical terms? For instance, Quad. What will be dimensions of a more robust, less inhibited Quad or Indo-Pacific strategy? Can you illustrate your approach?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think there are several elements in terms of the Quad, and in terms of a broader partnership or an alliance. I use alliance in a very loose sense. I mean, alignments are, it doesn't necessarily require a written agreement. I mean, we can think about the fact that the United States and China had a an alignment against the Soviet Union in the latter half of the Cold War without formal military alliance. And similarly, Pakistan and China had a very strong alliance without actually a written without a written treaty. So, and I'm talking about alignment, which is kind of a more loose rather than NATO or something of that nature, which might be difficult for domestic political reasons. But in terms of the specifics of that, I think part of that is enhancing the capabilities of the countries in the region. So India's capability, or Vietnam's, or Philippines, or Japan, all of these countries can enhance their capabilities by helping each other through intelligence, through even direct military assistance from the United States or from India or from Japan to members of that group. And so that is one set of things that can be done. But I think even more important than the military aspects of the Quad or the military aspects of that kind of balancing is a broader international political balance, which is in terms of what China wants in multilateral organizations, for example, or what China is trying to do with the Belt and Road, for example. So those are areas in which all of these countries can cooperate in ensuring that they all speak with one voice, that they all coordinate their actions, whether it is in, not just in WHO, but in other aspects of the United Nations, in terms of if China targets one of these countries for punitive trade sanctions, then others can join together with that particular country. So there are a whole host of things not going beyond the military efforts that these countries can do and really have to do, because definitely on the trade front, we see China singling out countries, and essentially when it singles out a South Korea or an Australia or even a Sweden or somebody like that, there is no pushback from others. And so that country is left to fend for itself. And of course, the balance of vulnerabilities is far greater for these smaller countries, even for the larger countries, even for Japan or Australia or India. Our vulnerability trade-wise is far greater vis-a-vis China individually, but collectively, I think it might be possible to at least reduce that vulnerability vis-a-vis China. And so it's somewhat similar to what Ambassador Bambawale just mentioned about decoupling, but more, let's say, strengthening our coupling with some of the other partners in the region, but even further away in Europe, who are also facing the same sort of threat, same sort of pressure from China. So those are, 2 or 3, 4 different issues, but, you could also talk about intelligence cooperation in terms of the seas, in terms of what China is doing, Five Eyes, expanding the Five Eyes program. All of those, I think, help in terms of managing China's external proclivities, external activities.
But Rajesh, one reality we are facing today is that there is a lot of anxiety about China's aggressive behavior, its so-called Wolf Warrior diplomacy, but all this is not translating into any effective response which can persuade China to change its course, say on Hong Kong or Taiwan or South China Sea, or even India-China borders. Do you anticipate, this situation can change if there is, greater coming together and working together of like-minded countries that you're referring to, acting in concert to deter China? Do you think that's going to happen?
I think it is difficult both to create that sort of a group, a partnership or an alignment in the region to deal with China. And I think it is quite possible that China might not respond appropriately, or China might, Chinese behavior so far in the starting from the pandemic onwards has been extremely, we have to recognize that China's behavior is not what any other country would do. For example, other countries have been under pressure at different points of time. They haven't done what China has done. We were in 1998 when we were under sanctions after the nuclear test. Our response was to find a way to resolve our differences with the United States, starting the talks between Jaswant Singh and Stop Talbot. That is what most countries would normally do. That is, if you are under pressure, you would try and talk your way out of that. China's response is, of course, to lash out in a manner that is in some ways self-defeating. But that is not something that we can help. I mean, China's behavior is China's business, and we can't really do much vis-a-vis what in terms of determining China's behavior. Normal states would behave in a different way. China, for whatever reason, either because it thinks it is strong enough to be able to weather these storms, or because because it feels that this is how to establish the trends and scare everybody else, and so that they would all be quiescent towards China. I'm not sure entirely what the reason is, but this is how China is behaving. So what others can do is not so much, I mean, trying to moderate China's behavior is one aspect, but also I think an equally important, or probably more important response should be to ensure that we are not harmed by these kinds of behavior. I think that is the first priority, and moving on to try and influence China's behavior can be a subsequent priority. But I think the first priority has to be to ensure that China's enormous power does not impinge negatively on us. I mean, once we do that, after that, we can sort of decide how to help China's behavior. I mean, I think that's a difficult task, but I think the primary task is something else.
Thanks, Rajesh. We'll come back to you later. Let me now move to Tom Miller. Tom has been watching, analyzing, reporting on developments in China and India for many years. He has lived in China for 14 years. Tom, when you were listening to comments made by Ambassador Gautam Bambawale and Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan, were you surprised? Do you see that something fundamental in changing in India's approach towards China? Are we really on the cusp of a turning point or watershed moment in India-China relations?
Well, let me first say thank you for having me, and thank you to the Institute of Chinese Studies. Particularly because it's a very, the other panelists are very, very distinguished, and I'm far less distinguished, so I'll do my best. I think what I want to try to do is to put this in sort of a broader context, a sort of international context, and the Chinese context. So, I mean, it seems to me that yes, the China-India relations do seem to be at an inflection point. Exactly how that pans out, I think it's still difficult to say, and I think it will depend partly on what happens on the LAC. But I think it's important to see what's going on, not as something as a part of a broader sort of international pushback. Now, at the moment, I think what's happening with India and China is another example of that. But India is not really yet part of a coordinated pushback, which is only just beginning to emerge anyway. And I think we need to look at where this has come from. And I think there was a fundamental shift in how the world viewed China, I think starting in about 2017. And I think it really began with Xi Jinping's appearance at Davos in January of that year, where he really sort of positioned himself as a sort of alternative global leader. And then in October of that year at the 19th Party Congress, that was when Xi Jinping declared himself as the core leader with no term limits, and declared a new era for China. And I think since then we've seen the starting of a much sort of broader pushback. So obviously you had the strategic rivalry with the US has come to the fore. For the first time, the US actually labeled China a strategic competitor. And then, of course, you had the beginnings of what people now term a new Cold War. I'm not sure if that really is the right term, because the economies of China and the US are entangled very, very deeply. But certainly we've seen a trade war and a tech war. But beyond that, we've seen the EU being to push back. We've seen a much more concerted attempt there to prevent Chinese investment in strategic sectors. The EU has called China a systemic rival. We've seen Australia pushing back as well. We've seen a broader sort of international criticism of what China's doing with Uyghur persecution, debt trap diplomacy, what's happening with the militarization of the South China Sea, Huawei, all sorts of things. But of course, there's been a hardening of this pushback since the COVID crisis. Obviously China has been seen as a bad actor here by silencing whistleblowers originally, and then by trying to prevent international inquiry. We've also seen a pushback against its so-called mask diplomacy. I think it saw a strategic opportunity there, and that has sort of blown back in its face. And as a result of all of these different factors, I think we're beginning to see other countries in the world, and I don't think India is quite there yet, beginning to move together. So, for example, we saw last month the foundation of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which has members from not just Western countries. There are some other Asian countries in there as well, trying to coordinate policies. We've also seen, of course, in the Asia region, the Quad Plus. This is very, very loose, but it does show an appetite, I think, in Asia, possibly for a slightly broader alliance, not necessarily against China, but a non-China alliance. And we've seen a push from the UK for an enlargement of the G10, maybe into a democratic 10. And I think India isn't yet a part of that, but I think there is a considerable appetite around the world, particularly in Western countries, to sort of bring India into that. So, is our India-China relations at an inflection point? Well, if I listen to the other distinguished panelists, yes, I think they are. I think the question then becomes, what does India do about that? And I think it has a choice it can make. Does it continue to seek strategic autonomy and sort of go it partly alone, or does it decide to sort of join the community of nations, which is beginning to form against China?
Thanks, Tom. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions on the issues you've raised. But let me turn to something Gautam talked about earlier. He talked about a sort of partial economic decoupling taking place between India and China. Now, this is one aspect you have monitored very closely over several years. India-China economic engagement. Do you also see that we are at the beginning of a fundamental shift in India's policy of seeking closer trade and investment linkages with China? If so, how will it pan out? There are some people who argue that India will end up hurting itself rather than hurting China. What is your take on it?
Well, I think this is fundamentally a political and diplomatic question for India. I don't think a full economic decoupling is really feasible, given India's reliance on Chinese imports. And I'll sort of come to that in a minute. But this, I think, is really a question for Mr. Modi and other Indian strategists. Will they pick India's national security interests over its economic interests? And the other panelists have been arguing that that is what it should do. Whether they decide to do that or not, I don't know. I think if China continues its pullback from the LAC, I think at least that gives Mr. Modi an option to make a less decisive policy break than he otherwise might have to make on this. And then he has to make a decision as to can he keep Chinese investment out of infrastructure that's critical to national security, while at the same time welcoming other investment into non-strategic areas. And obviously, I think that is going to be a difficult thing. But I think to break this down a little bit, I think we can look at trade on the one hand and then investment on the other. Now, of course, India for the last decade or so, or even longer than a decade, has been trying to reform its lopsided relationship with China. But of course, India's trade deficit has only grown. It's doubled over the past decade or so. And there've been lots of talks about India exporting more, sort of particularly of IT and pharma to China, and that hasn't really panned out. At the same time, India's become much more dependent on Chinese inputs. Now, this isn't just kind of cheap consumer goods. It isn't even just sort of capital goods. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time wandering around Indian factories, and you do see expensive Italian and German machinery, but also you see an awful lot of cheaper but pretty good Chinese machinery. I think that's vital to Indian factories. But beyond that too, India is terribly reliant on inputs of intermediate goods, particularly when it comes to electronic equipment and pharma. The bulk of the active ingredients in pharma come from Chinese inputs. When it comes to telecoms equipment and semiconductor devices, they tend to come from China. And so, India's been pushing its Make in India program. Yes, it hasn't been a success, but, for it to have any chance of succeeding, India needs these inputs, and it's going to struggle to get them, I think, from anywhere else. India can't suddenly manufacture them itself, and it may find it difficult to find them from any other source. Yes, it is importing more, for example, electronic goods from say Vietnam these days, but those are tiny compared to compared to imports from China. And also, I spent some time last year in Vietnam looking at Vietnam's capacity, to take on some of the manufacturing load from China. Vietnam has big capacity issues itself. As a country, it's much smaller in terms of its economy than, say, Guangdong, over the border. So I think that's going to be very, very difficult for India, and it'll affect India's exports as well if it does decide to blockade or cut down massively on Chinese imports. Then you have the other side of the equation, and that's investment. China recently, particularly in the last 5 years, has invested a lot in India. There are different numbers out there. Brookings reckon 26 billion, including some investments that haven't come in yet. The lowest number that I can find is 15 billion since 2005. When it comes to tech, when it comes to manufacturing and infrastructure, these are very, very important, particularly when it comes to India's startup economy, which is something that Mr. Modi has tried to push very, very hard indeed. And so, I think that if India does take a tough line here, yes, I think it will be very, very painful. And I think a full decoupling just simply isn't possible. But, fundamentally, this isn't an economic decision. It comes down to national security first. And if you decide to do this, you do it with the full knowledge that it's going to hurt. But perhaps that is more important. And this is something I think that other countries around the world are deciding too now. If you decide to loosen ties with China, it is going to hurt economically, but maybe that's worthwhile.
Thanks, Tom, for the first putting what's happening in India-China relations in the larger context of the broader international pushback against China, and also for pointing out what's motivating India's current efforts to loosen economic ties with China. I'm sure we'll come back to these issues during Q&A session. Let me now open the conversation for questions to the floor. I'll begin by inviting Jyoti Malhotra, National and Strategic Affairs Editor of our media partner, The Print, to pose her questions to panelists. Over to you, Jyoti.
Thank you so much, Ashok. Thank you so much for inviting me to ask these first questions. I have a couple, and if I could ask each of you, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, good to see you. Rajesh, hi Rajesh, and Tom, I think we met last at the Jaipur Literature Festival in Jaipur a couple of years ago. So my first question is to you, Gautam, and it's about internal cohesion. You said some time ago that, a few minutes ago, that there will be pain if India implements the kind of tough policies it should, especially after 20 soldiers were killed, and that's the new line in the sand. But as Tom points out, how much of this pain can India afford? And when you have an opposition right now, which is not working in tandem with the government, how do you expect this national unity in the face of this big challenge that China poses? That's the first question. And Ashok, can I just ask one more question? And then
please go ahead.
And my second, so if Gautam, you or Rajesh, if either of you would like to answer this. And Tom, I have a question for you, which is that, you know China really well. But I'm just wondering that whether China is changing inside. And, for example, the numbers of the casualties of in the Ladakh 15 June clash. We don't know how many Chinese soldiers were killed. There are reports that there were more Chinese than there were Indian. But the question is, are people inside China also asking these questions? Younger people, especially as they integrate with the world, they speak English. And all of you China hands know that there is a lot of change taking place. So are they asking questions of their own dear leader? And what kind of change do you see?
So Gautam, will you start?
Yeah, sure. I'll thank you very much for those questions, Jyoti. I'll try to focus on the first one. Absolutely, there is going to be, you cannot do this without pain. So if anyone thinks that it is going to be painless, I think they have they need to re-examine their own beliefs, etc. Let me also point out two other things, and these are from the practical world. One is that if we had thought of the pain which would happen, we would have never taken a decision which we did in 1998 to go overtly nuclear. Because at that time, if you recollect, a lot of people were talking about sanctions which would be placed on India, the kind of economic havoc that would cause, and the amount of pain that would be, would the Indian people would have to bear. But we did go nuclear, we did go through that period of sanctions, and we have come out the better for it. So as a nation, as a society, we have to take our decisions. And as Tom very rightly said, I think he hit the nail on the head when he said that this is not an economic decision, this is a political or a strategic decision, and I believe we have to take that decision. Let me just give one more example from the practical world, Ashok, and this is, I think, something which others in our country and definitely in ICS must hear. If you look at the telecom sector, just take a look at Reliance Jio. They don't have a single input in their telecom frameworks from China. And yet they're competitive, yet they're doing well, and they're sitting very pretty today with tons of investment flowing into that particular company. I am not a votary for a particular businessman, but definitely here is an example from the practical world where you can do without Chinese inputs and without Chinese parts and so on and so forth. So I rest my case there, and I'll stop there, Ashok.
Who will take the second question?
I'm happy to
Tom,
take.
Tom, yeah, Tom, please go ahead.
Well, I suppose the first thing I should say that is, although yes, so I did live in China for a long time, and I've spent a lot of time there. My wife is Chinese, and I'm still very much in contact. Unfortunately, for obvious reasons, I haven't been there for quite a long time. So I haven't been there since all was kicked off. But is China changing inside? Yes, it is, but I don't think it's changing in the way you might like it to. I think that China has become a much more nationalistic place since Xi Jinping took over, and that the sort of nationalist push for the China dream and rejuvenation, and actually all those things I was talking about in Jaipur a couple of years ago, I think most people buy into that. At least they do in public. Now, of course, in China, there is no public space for disagreement. Of course, in private, people have different views, and I happen to have quite a lot of Chinese friends who are very liberal in their instincts, and a lot of them can't stand Xi Jinping. And so those views are out there. But my impression, at least, is that they're more prevalent, actually, among people who are a little bit older, people in their 40s and 50s, people who grew up in the 80s during the protests, and actually less prevalent among young people who may be more international and more socially liberal than perhaps their parents or grandparents, but actually, they really buy into Chinese nationalism. And some people, I think, are quite aware of what China's like. It doesn't mean that they disapprove of it. So just to give you a little kind of anecdote, I was having dinner with a relative of my wife's last year, and we were talking about sort of powerful leaders in history, often great, but sort of evil leaders, if you like. And this person said that, well, Xi Jinping, of course, he's more fascist than Hitler, and the Chinese Communist Party are more fascist than the fascists, than the Nazis. And he said that with a laugh. He wasn't criticizing them. He was saying, well, that's just the way it is. But they are strong and powerful. And so I think there is some awareness out there there's a lot of awareness of what the party's like, but there isn't that much criticism, and there isn't room for criticism, sadly.
Thanks, Tom. Let me take some questions from the chat box.
Just the internal cohesion question, if that's...
Oh, sorry. The internal cohesion. Who will take that question? Rajesh would like to address that. Internal
have-
cohesion as a constraint in putting
Yeah.
together a sort of clear-eyed, hard-headed China policy today.
Yeah, I just wanted to also touch upon that cost question that Ambassador Bambawale answered correctly. But I think there's one other way to look at the cost issue, which is that one way or the other, you're going to pay the cost. We can pay the cost as insurance over a period of time, or you can pay it all of a sudden, as we did in '62. So we had, one way to sort of look at this cost is that you spread it out in whether you're building military muscle or whatever else. You do that over a period of time by building up capabilities and building in your resilience and things like that. So that, if you don't do that, you are eventually going to pay a price. And so it is, when you're looking at cost, you look at the cost, not only in terms of what you pay now, but also what you will pay eventually if you don't do what you need to do now. I think it's, so there, I think that also has to be considered when we look at the cost issue. In terms of the internal cohesion part, I think right now, internal cohesion is not an issue, I would think, because the government has a majority on its own. It doesn't really need the opposition. It is within the BJP. The prime minister is supreme, and so it is in many respects like the Congress and the Indian Parliament in the 1950s, which is a single party dominant and a single person, especially on foreign policy, dominant within that single party. I think so. That cohesion, it would be nice to have that cohesion, but it is frankly quite irrelevant considering the state of the opposition today, or compared to that state of the opposition in the 1950s. So I think the cohesion part is less relevant currently. I mean, it may become a factor later. I don't know, but I mean, I think right now, I don't think that is as important a factor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me now move to some questions and issues which have been raised in the chat box. We have with us Commodore R.S. Vasan, Director of Chennai Center for China Studies. Commodore Vasan has several questions. I will request you to pose one question because of constraint of time, and please name the speaker you would like to address your question to. Commodore Vasan, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, sir. I must say, this question answer session has been a wonderful one. And thanks for all those wonderful inputs. Like you said, I have posed many questions, but let me restrict to one, which is for Mr. Tom. He's been a China hand for over 15 years. And, he seems to have doubts about perhaps India's ability to come out of this. Whereas, I totally go along with Ambassador Gautam, who is very positive about the way India is in a position to deal with this. So on the issue of decoupling, I would like to say and pose this question to Tom and say that India is in a better position today, because when you look at the scales, it's not that it is all against India. There are people who are willing to come in, and we have our own strengths there. We can play to our strengths. So could you please explain and say why you appear pessimistic to me in terms of India's ability to take on this bully called China?
So Tom, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic. I mean, what I was trying to point out is that, if India does make a national security decision to decouple or, at least loosen its economic ties with China, that is going to be painful. And this is happening, of course, at a time when India's economy is in serious trouble. India's economy was in trouble even before the pandemic. Slowing at its, GDP was at its slowest rate for a decade or so before then, and now we're seeing the economy essentially, at least in the short term, collapsing. And so frankly, India needs all the investment right now it can get. India's biggest problem, I've always thought, is the lack of jobs. India needs to create 10 to 12 million new jobs every year just to employ new members of the workforce. I know that employment has gone down a little bit unemployment has gone down a little bit in the last month since, it hit heights of sort of 24% or whatever the official number was in kind of April, May. But it's a very, very serious problem. And if India wants to employ people, it needs labor-intensive manufacturing. It needs lots of construction, and it needs some of the things actually that China can help to bring through its investment in things like factories. And so, if India decides it doesn't want that investment, that will hurt India. And I think people will have to be clear about that. Can the investment come from elsewhere? Yes, to a certain extent, but this will be painful for India's economy. That's all I'm saying. I when it comes to the larger strategic question, I think India very much should join with like-minded countries. It should make a decision to strategically align. I completely agree on that. I think strategic autonomy these days, I think that's time. I think that's gone. I think if India wants to balance, it has to join with other countries. And I think, if it does that, then I think it will stand in a much stronger position. So I don't think I'm pessimistic. I think I'm being realistic.
Thanks. Can I respond, sir? Can I respond for just 20 seconds?
Sure,
Yes.
go ahead.
I know. Like you said, we're not just looking at China. I don't have to get everything from China. And even if I had to pay an extra price, I'll do so because there are national interests. And, in the last 50 years, there is not one occasion on which China has supported us. So why should I oblige him? So if there are other options, even if it's at an extra cost, I will go for it. I think this is what even Ambassador Gautam Bambawale is trying to hint at. I don't have to depend on China. We need to change the way we do business with China, is my strong appeal to everybody here.
Okay.
Thanks.
Could I just respond to that?
Yeah, please, Tom, go ahead.
I completely understand how you feel. I think if I was Indian, I'd probably feel the same way. But all I'm pointing out is that, for example, India's most powerful industry globally is probably pharma. Exporting generic drugs around the world. That's a big deal for India. But it gets the majority of its active ingredients from China, and actually, China is the only place that makes them, right? So, if you decide that you don't want to import those, then you're going to hit one of India's most important industries, and you're going to hit Indian exports. That's what I'm saying. It'll make India economically, it'll make India weaker, and it's something that you have to acknowledge.
Ashok, if I could just
come
in
Gautam,
for
please.
just half a minute on that whole question.
Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I agree with what Tom is saying, but there are investable resources available from other countries too. It's not just China, which has surplus investable resources which are available. What is required is for India to make it easier to do business in our own country. And then those investable resources will flow in from other parts of the world. I think that this particular crisis, which is the COVID crisis, plus you can add the India-China border crisis, I hope these two crises help the government of India and Indians in general to change the economic framework within our own country so that these other investable resources from other parts of the world will flow in. So let me just say that, and I don't disagree with Tom that trying to decouple will involve pain in India. There's no doubt about that, but I think we need to take that pain if we want to send the right strategic message to China.
Thanks. Let me take another question from the chat box. Ambassador Bhaskar Balakrishnan. Bhaskar, you also have more than one question. Will you select one question and also address it to a particular panelist? Unmute yourself. Please
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I don't have a question as such. I just had a few comments which I put in the chat box for what it's worth. So by and large, I agree completely with Ambassador Bambawale. I think he said everything I have to say. As far as the pharma industry is concerned, well, China is not a trader on level playing field. So it undercut our API industry and slowly squeezed it out of business. But the API industry in India is able to come back in short order. It's no problem at all. Gujarat is full of entrepreneurs who will fill the gap before you can realize what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me now move to people who have raised their hand. I'll start with Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia. Ambassador Bhatia, will you ask your question?
Thank you very much, Chair. Once again, a very stimulating dialogue. I have just one question, because these days, everywhere you go, and the discussion is on China, external balancing is the most favorite formula. So my question is to Professor Rajesh, who already has said that external balancing is not going to be easy. It's a difficult proposition. My question is, can it come through if India only wants to receive, or will India be willing to give also? By that, what I mean is that merely democratic values commonality and containment of China cannot be the lasting basis of this kind of alignment that he's referring to. So what should be the basis, and what role economic cooperation will play in that? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think the primary basis has to be balancing China, because these are not, most alliances are essentially short-term, temporary efforts to deal with temporary problems. I mean, these are not alliances are not formed because we like other people. Alliances are formed because we fear other people, and that is the basis of all alliances and all alignments. And therefore, that is a primary basis. But in order to do that, especially with a country like China, especially given China's enormous economic capacities, its trade relations and whatnot, as others have said just before this, we need to also create, potentially, I think eventually, if situation continues the way it is, we are going to see some form of economic decoupling, which means basically there has to be some level of economic cooperation between some sort of a, it can be called a democratic economic alliance, but it's essentially going to be just an economic alliance to protect each of these countries, to protect all of us, all the various countries that are worried about China and which are vulnerable to China. From using China's enormous economic capacities to hurt them, to make them, to exploit the vulnerabilities of Japan or Australia or India or anybody else. So eventually, I think it will have to grow into some of these other elements. But it is not a values-based alignment. I mean, alignments generally are not. And so we can talk about democracy and free and open Indo-Pacific and things like that. Those are all nice, those are nice catchwords, but that's not the basis of the relationships. We will include potentially Vietnam in that. I mean, it's not exactly a democracy. So we are going to have to include partners in that, who are united only by this one element, which is fear of China. But that is the way, like I said, all alignments are. So I don't think there's any other real basis for it beyond that fear of China.
Thanks, Rajesh. I'll now invite my colleague Samanvay Huda to ask the question. Samanvay?
Thank you, sir. I'm afraid my net's a little scrappy, so I won't switch my camera on. My question is to all three participants, panelists, sorry. One of the options available to counter Chinese aggression along the LAC is opening up new theaters to improve India's bargaining power, basically follow a tit-for-tat strategy. How do you think China would respond to such a proactive, aggressive, certainly unprecedented military countermeasure by India? And taking from this, since this is definitely not the last time you will have border incidents, do you think it would be possible for India to credibly attempt something like deterrence by punishment rather than just deterrence by denial? Yes.
So, Gautam, it's a tricky question. Would you like to take it? Quid pro quo strategy.
Yeah, I'll just say a few words and then hand over to the other speakers, the other participants, the other panelists. Look, Samanvay, that's an excellent question. And let me tell you my thinking, not that, I don't no longer work with the government, so I can't vouch for whether the government is thinking on these lines. But I tend to agree with what you say that, we cannot all the time, even in the India-China border areas, all the time be reactive. the best form of defense is offense. And at some point of time, we will have to be proactive. And I think that time is coming soon. And I do hope that, we will be able to be proactive rather than just reactive all the time. So I'll stop there. I won't go into further details of Samanvay's question.
Rajesh, Tom would like to add something?
Yeah, I'll take a shot, but I don't really know whether there are areas where we can do something of that nature. But more importantly is the problem that our orientation, both in terms of military orientation, but also in terms of our grand strategic orientation, has been defensive. I mean, that is, it's well known. It's not a surprise. We have said that before, that it is defensively oriented. So that and it is not easy to turn a military around and that is defensively oriented to conduct offensive operations. And even if it is walking into empty territory, that is still requires a change in orientation. I suppose it can be done if we have those kinds of areas, but like I said, it requires a attitudinal change, as Ambassador Bambawale also mentioned. I mean, will that come? I don't know. I mean, that is something that I can't predict.
I'll try to answer this, but I'm not a military expert at all. But my gut feeling would be that it would be foolhardy and rather dangerous on India's part. I think that if you are proactive militarily, then I think China would strike back very, very hard indeed. And I think you are risking a proper hot war if that happens. China needs to show that it's strong. And what China's been doing for the past, I started I think really in 2008, but it's got much stronger under Xi Jinping since 2012. This whole narrative of the China dream and national rejuvenation, it does underpin everything. China wants to be, it doesn't want to be humiliated again. And, India felt humiliated in 1962. China felt humiliated in the 1840s, and that whole narrative of national humiliation is still there. And it's all about China's territory and its core interests. And if it feels that those are being threatened, I don't think it's going to fear, sending troops to their death. And I think you'd be risking war. I think it's very, very dangerous indeed.
Thanks.
Can I just
take
sure, another shot at this? Yeah. I do agree with this last that it is potentially leading to war. But there is, and there are dangers involved in such a strategy. But I would note two things. One is that at least as of now, along the
Rajesh has a book on Indian Army, so please go ahead.
Well, that was on a very different aspect of the Indian Army, but at least on the LAC, from what I understand from other experts who examined that very closely, we do have a slight advantage. As of now, this is likely to change, obviously, as China's military capabilities increase. But despite China's better infrastructure, they do have some disadvantages, and therefore, if at all we are going to do something or we can do something, it is possibly only in the short term. I don't think in the long term that strategy is over. That will be open to us. The second aspect I would mention is that, yes, even if it does lead to war, there is a deterrence logic to go to war even if you expect to lose, and that is, for example, the Egyptian calculation in the 73 Yom Kippur War was that, not that they expected to win, but they wanted to show China, they wanted to show Israel that the status quo was unacceptable. And so that, even if China potentially wins that war, it is not going to be an easy victory, and it is going to be a difficult victory. And as happened with Vietnam in 1979, I think the cost of that would be quite heavy, even on China, even though others will pay, even though India will pay a cost also. So there is a deterrence logic to doing that, even if you do not expect to do well, even if you do not expect to win. But there is also, I think, at least a short-term window where India might be able to at least hold its own along the border because of the way because of the order battle along the border.
Could I just respond to that? Because I thought that was fascinating.
Okay, keep it brief, Tom.
What is the likelihood of India doing this?
Oh, I'm not talking about the likelihood. I'm just talking about.
Reserve this topic for another discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, can I now invite Ambassador Vijay Nambiar to ask his question? Ambassador Nambiar.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I generally agree with the drift of the argument that it is things are going, in a sense, the inflection point has been reached, and I agree with Gautam in general. But there are some dilemmas that this will pose. Two things. One is Prime Minister Modi, when he went even to Ladakh, his main theme was development, development, development. He mentioned that, and this kind of change, when you're putting security before that, it is going to we're going to have a very, very major cost in the immediate term, in the short term, on development and on our development. And that is something I think he'll have to now in a sense, transform the narrative to sacrificing development for the national purpose, for the national security. That's one thing which will happen. The second thing is, you're talking about not accepting to be a junior partner to China. But by moving on the other side, you are actually accepting being junior partner to the United States in many ways, because particularly one implication of that would be some of our assets, some of our traditional friends like Russia, we are going to have to make certain decisions. We may have faced pressures in terms of how we modulate our policies, our dependence to some extent, and the friendship. It is likely to affect, if we are going to very decisively, in a sense, move in that direction of the United States, we lose our strategic autonomy in that sense also. And that is going to cost us. I was wondering whether the participants, some of the panelists could actually comment on these two things. Thank you.
Gautam would like to.
Yeah, I would like to take the little part about not being a junior partner to China, but being a junior partner to the US. Just like to, to respond to that bit of it. The way I look at it is that there is no question and there's no option of being a junior partner to China. The Chinese have already indicated what kind of the relationship they want with India by doing what they have done in the summer of 2020. There's no question of being a partner with China. Junior or senior is something which doesn't come into the question. So I think Xi Jinping and China has decided what is the kind of relationship they want with India, and we just have to now respond and react to that and move ahead with that. So that's my immediate reaction to Ambassador Nambiar's point on this particular thing, and I'll stop there, Ashok.
Yeah, Rajesh, on the issue of strategic autonomy, you have talked about this issue, closer strategic alignment with USA. Would like to add something?
Sure, sir. I think, the way I look at it is not so much about being a junior partner or any other kind of partner, but basically it is a question of security. I mean, it is, you have to first be secure before you can be anything else. And so right now, the United States is not a threat to India. It is not a threat to other countries. And that's one reason why they are aligning with the United States against China. So China represents a threat, and therefore, as long as China represents a threat, then you have to respond to that threat. As far as strategic autonomy goes, I would suggest, sir, that our strategic autonomy is more of a problem if we are weak or if we are insecure. I mean, that is as much of a threat to strategic autonomy if we cannot follow our interests because of a threat from China, as it is in terms of dealing with that threat. And so, if sometimes alignments can actually enhance your strategic autonomy. The idea that alignments always constrain your strategic autonomy, I think, would be questionable in that respect. So that strategic autonomy, we have to look at it in terms of what is really constraining their strategic autonomy. And I think it is a threat from China that is constraining their strategic autonomy, that is sort of limiting our maneuver room. As far as Russia goes, yes, we do have a relationship, obviously, with Russia, but we also have to understand Russia's compulsions, and so Russia feels whoever is responsible for it, whether the West is responsible for it, whether it was NATO expansion, whatever, it doesn't matter to us. I mean, the point is that Russia feels under pressure from the West, and therefore it is moving towards China. And so, and they may be uncomfortable with that. Again, that's irrelevant to us. I mean, what matters to us is not the empathy that we have with Russia for their condition, for whatever else, for the relationship that we had, but much more crudely what they can do for us and what they cannot do for us. And at this stage, they are constrained because of their relationship with China. And so I think we need to understand their compulsions, and we need to act on the basis of our compulsions. And I think it's not about, the fact that Russia may not be, it's not that Russia is anti-India, but it is that Russia has needs for China, and Russia needs China more than it needs India.
Thanks.
And I think we need to recognize that.
Thanks, Rajesh. We are running out of time. So what I'll do now, I'll invite the 3-4 other participants to pose their questions very briefly, 1 or 2 sentences each, and then the panelists will make their concluding remarks responding to those questions. I'll start with Dave Lewis. Dave, can you come in? And keep your question very precise.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Kanta. Hello, everyone. I can say I'm part of the generation to have benefited from the 1988 consensus that Ambassador Bambawale talked about. And I'm really grateful for the opportunities that our generation has gotten from this policy of engagement for the last 2 decades. I want to bring this back to the economic question. I think Tom addressed the potential costs to India really well, so I won't repeat. So I just want to ask a question maybe to Ambassador Bambawale, is when you talk about decoupling and recalibration, I think I agree with you, but my question is where do we draw the line? And also, what kind of message can we expect from China where we say, okay, now we can shift back to our sort of old consensus, or maybe a new old consensus? And is there any past experience to show that sort of open confrontation, as I think we're seeing in this discussion as well as the larger media, will actually sort of bring about the change in behavior from Beijing that we accept? And also, I'm concerned by, even though we say this is a political decision, and I agree, we're also seeing a larger discourse around this sort of nationalists thinking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, and this idea of that actually it's not just China, we also want to be more national. And I wonder if this is going to be piggyback on this China sort of bashing to both distort our economic sort of goals. So I was wondering if you could briefly address that. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, and then Yogendra Kumar, and Admiral Muralidharan, in that order.
Thank you, Chair. Am I audible?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. A very brief question. Given the fact that we have very little trust left in China, and that any agreement signed with China is going to be breached, it's not a question of if, but it's a question of when. What is the meaning of the pullout? Is it that we are postponing the inevitable of having a showdown with China, buying time? Because that means somewhere where or the other, we will have to have a showdown.
Ambassador Yogendra Kumar. Yogi, keep your question very brief.
Thank you. I have 2 quick comments and plus questions.
One is that limit yourself to question, if you don't mind, because we are running out of time. Just
no, question. Then let it be. Then I pass my chance. Let somebody ask the question.
Because, yes, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. Keep it very brief. Yeah.
Okay. So I have.
We can't hear you. We have lost you. Okay, we'll get back to you. Yeah.
Ashok, I just have one related bit about Taiwan, whether it's time to have a FTA with Taiwan.
Okay, sure. Admiral Muralidharan? Yogi, are you back?
I'm back. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
Right. One question about the inflection point. If we phrase the inflection point the sense that whether we see China at an inflection point or the world situation or the world development inflection point, and as compared to what India is, do we get different kind of options when we explore our relationship with the Chinese in the current context? Because then I think when you look at it in that perspective, I think our options would be different. That's one point. The second one is the question of the confidence building measure, the entire mechanism that we have, beginning with strategic communication to site commander level communication. Now, what has been the deficiency in this kind of a mechanism where we could not raise the scale up to the whatever level we had to make sure that the kind of trends emerging in Chinese behavior, they could have been checked either in a preemptive manner or in a proactive manner. And whether when we decide to review the mechanism, do we have some ideas about that? Thank you.
Thanks. Admiral Muralidharan?
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. My basic question was, in all this fascinating discussion, we never talked of the sea. Considering that China has got long lines of maritime trade, both coming in and out. And if you recollect some years ago, just before the Quad, when we just talked of exercising with 3 or 4 of the nations that we're talking of today, there were a lot of hue and cry in China and some of their supporters in India, and we had to call off that exercise. So maritime is one area where I think we could put pressure on them, and we have the capability to reach out at far out into the sea, right into the South China Sea. Comments on this?
Thanks. We still have at least a dozen questions in the chat box and raised hand. Unfortunately, we run out of time. So my apologies to colleagues for unable to invite them to ask their questions. Now we'll return to the panelists, this time in the reverse order. Tom will speak first, then Rajesh, and then finally Gautam. Tom, please go ahead. And keep your comments to about 2 minutes each.
Am I unmuted? Yes, I am now.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the comment I would make is that, everyone needs to work with China to a certain extent. We don't really have the ability not to work with them. But I think we should do so from a position of strength. And I think that like-minded countries, whether you want to call them democracies or anything else, I think we need to coordinate our approach and work a lot more closely together. And yes, that might include sort of working together on maritime issues, inviting Australia, for example, to join the Malabar exercise, all those sorts of things. But I think India, to some extent, has to decide what sort of country it wants to be. For example, there was a statement in the UN Human Rights Commission the other day, when the UK put out a statement condemning what was happening with the national security law in Hong Kong. And I think 27 countries or thereabouts supported it. But 53 countries didn't. And those were the countries that essentially sort of China has bought, a lot of African countries among them. India, it sort of sat in the middle. And the world does appear to be bifurcating, and I think India needs to make a choice a little bit. Is it going to get closer to the more liberal countries? You may say Western countries, but it's Western plus, or not. And I would like to see India doing that. Of course, that may depend too on the direction of politics in India itself, because the Indian polity, recently has been, how do I put it? That there have been question marks as to sort of what country India wants to be under the current leadership. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Rajesh?
Yeah, I think the maritime front is definitely an important aspect, but I think it is also, it can't be one isolated element. I think that there has to be a concerted sort of look at what are the areas where we can actually put pressure, or not just putting pressure, but also where we can cooperate with potential partners in terms of dealing with China. So I think that definitely is one, considering all the choke points that China has along its coast. I think that definitely is one. But I mean, maritime domain awareness is another aspect, intelligence, all of those. But that, the problem, I think, along with many other problems, one of the problems that we have is that we haven't sort of sat down and looked at all of these various elements of Indian power. And I think we need to do that, and we need to sort of see all of these as it were the traditional way of looking at it, fingers on a hand, and sort of all of them have to act in concert. And that definitely requires, I think, one area where we are really weak is in terms of providing that political direction that all of those different elements of our power can work together. I think so. I think maritime is definitely an important aspect of that. We start by inviting Australia to Malabar, for example, and so on. So that I think that definitely is an important aspect. But I think it has to be one of the various elements, one of the many elements, I think.
Gautam?
Yeah, many interesting questions, and definitely I would like to discuss with Dave Lewis, but some other time, Ashok, because there's not enough time. Let me close with just 2 points. One is about 8 or 9 years ago, there were 2 broad themes which were being asked about China. One is whether the rise of China is going to be peaceful. I think the answer is very clear. It's not going to be a peaceful rise. The second question which was being asked and theme which was being debated was whether China is a responsible stakeholder in the international system. I think the answer today is also very clear. China is not a responsible stakeholder, it's an irresponsible stakeholder. Indian policy must go on the basis of these 2 judgments and move forward from here on. What exactly that policy will be, we can discuss and debate. But I think these are 2 important inputs which we need to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gautam. I'm afraid we have run out of time. In fact, we are beyond our allotted time. So I would like to conclude, this ICS conversation. Let me, thank 3 panelists. I think all 3 of them were brilliant. They were candid in their remarks. They were perceptive. And they raised a whole lot of very important issues, both in the initial remarks as well as in response to questions from participants. Thank you very much, Gautam, Rajesh, Tom. And I would also like to thank all the participants for their participation, for kind of questions they raised. I believe we had very rich discussions this afternoon. So let me conclude this ICS conversation by thanking all of you, and we hope to continue this conversation on another occasion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.